the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Hello, and thanks for joining us once again for the Downtown Podcast. I'm Jim Hancock, the political editor of Downtown in Business, and I'm joined by my good friend Jo Phillips, a former aide to former Liberal Democrat leader Paddy Ashdown, and now the scourge of Nigel Farage every Tuesday evening on GB News. Frank McKenna couldn't make it today. That's not his fault. I changed the day because I couldn't make it yesterday, so Jo and I will be soldiering on alone. Jo, if I can begin on a pretty serious note, as you know, I'm always sort of looking out for my historical resonances of things. And it occurred to me yesterday, when we were commemorating the liberation of the German concentration camps at Auschwitz. And of course, the Germans had left some poor people behind, but they had force marched an awful lot of them in a desperate attempt to try and cover up their evil deeds back to Germany. That march was going on in the bitter winter snows of 1945. And the very same day yesterday, hundreds of thousands of Gazans were marching north to their ruined homes. I make no judgment about the two things, but it just shows that there are unresolved issues in history that we need to continue to pay attention to.
Absolutely, and I think, that was a very sombre moment, and there are, I think, about 50 survivors from Auschwitz still left alive who were able to attend some of the commemorations and ceremonies. I must say I was surprised that King Charles was the first British monarch to go. I always had assumed that the Queen would have done, but obviously not. And I think, the coming together of people, leaders, presidents, royalty from all over the world to mark this, it's very important, particularly in these troubled times. And as you say, Jim, we see people going back to the rubble of their homes because they would rather put a tent on what used to be their home. The desire to be home, the desire to go back and rebuild is something so fundamental to humanity, I think. And we're going to see a lot more people moving around the world. And I think it gives us a moment to reflect on the hatred and vitriol directed towards immigrants across the world. And, in a week where we saw Elon Musk, unfortunately, raising his hand twice in what seemed to be a salute not that far removed from a Nazi salute, I think we should do well to reflect on the forces of evil that are still in the world.
Yes. Well, some people on discussions last night were making the point that it can be a slippery slope from treating other people as other, starting to be disrespectful of democratic institutions, and it can lead, there's no inevitability about it, but it can lead to authoritarian rule, dictatorship, and ultimately, and I'm not saying remotely this applies to anybody in the world at the moment, but we have to be vigilant against ending up with what we've just been marking yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most horrifying things that I've seen over the last couple of days is a survey for Channel 4 that showed young people, the so-called Gen Zers, would prefer a dictator to a democratically elected government. They want strong leadership, they want authoritarianism, they would rather have the military in charge, they want strong leaders who don't have to bother with elections. And at the same time, they are talking about, a need for revolution. Well, those things are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I mean, that is a startling survey, and it's something we need to give an awful lot of thought to. I mean, I think, our generation has to bear some responsibility for having our children, our grandchildren, beginning to think like that. And what responsibility have we got? We mess things up so much that they don't have this respect. Because it's one thing to be skeptical about politicians, but this survey, I mean, it's only one survey, but nevertheless, perhaps unthinkingly, sort of wanting to sort of demolish all the sort of safeguards and guardrails that protect us from tyranny.
Exactly. Something, as you say, it's a wake-up call.
And the way that Donald Trump is handling himself in the United States is, in many ways, I mean, you say he's fulfilling his democratic mandate, and we may come on to the long-term effects on democratically elected leaders in Europe and the effective styles that seems to be presaging. But it really is quite startling, isn't it?
Yes, and I mean, some of the things that he is trying to do or saying he's going to do probably won't come to anything. For instance, the getting rid of the right of people who are born in America to have citizenship, which actually America is one of the very few countries, if not the only country in the world, where that is the case. But it goes against the American Constitution, so there's already a legal challenge on that. But I think, what people find attractive and what, some people in this country and elsewhere are looking to is that sense of momentum, that sense of energy of, right, come on, let's get these things done, let's sort it out. And I think, we've talked about it often on this podcast with Frank, that lacking momentum, that lack of energy that has come from a government only elected with a huge majority in July. And I think, it's a compare and contrast. And whilst most of us would probably not want to support the moves that Trump is making, and he's laying people off, he's sacking people left, right and centre, he's making, a government in his own image, if you like, but he is doing stuff at pace. And that is sometimes what people need, particularly after, the last few years of post-COVID, war in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, where they feel powerless.
Maybe that's why the Chancellor is apparently tomorrow going to be energising her growth plans. You've got this, what I still regard as quite a startling development, the project to have a third runway at Heathrow Airport, for two reasons. One is that we've been back and forth over this issue for many years, and with the very best will in the world, it's going to have no impact really on the economy until when it's built, which I would guess would be 2040. But it does come into conflict with the environmental policies of the government. But I'm just trying to stick on this momentum thing for a moment. I want to raise three particular things with you. Do you think that the government have been stung by the critics, and that we are seeing an attempt by the Chancellor to inject more energy and perhaps more positivity into the economic strategy?
Yes, I do, and I think she got a rather frosty reception in the snow-clad area of Davos last week. That, having been feted and, widely regarded well by the business and the international business community, they've basically turned around to her and said, come on, love, get a grip, this is not right. I mean, there are several things here. One is, yes, I think you're right. I think the government have been stung. Quite why it's taken them this long to realise that their message isn't getting through, or their message is incomprehensible, Lord alone knows. So yes, they are trying to be a bit more positive, be a bit more upbeat, and come up with things. But unfortunately, I think people's patience is very, very limited when it comes to politics. And here we are 6 months on, and so she's come up with this idea of a Heathrow third runway. Well, there are many arguments for a third runway at a massive airport hub, but it is completely contradictory to everything they have said and aspired to with regard to climate change, because there's no way to sugarcoat the pill. Flying is not very good for the environment. And of course, we know from the nonsense of HS2, 2040, you'd be lucky to get it through. The only good thing, Jim, on that is that Boris Johnson, you might remember, said he would lay down in front of a bulldozer if the third runway went ahead. And I did actually say on GB News last week that I would be more than happy to drive the bulldozer if somebody could get Boris to lie in the road.
But I mean, Ed Miliband shows no sign of resigning over this issue.
No, they won't. And I think, in some ways, I think that makes them look weak. And it's not something that is tangible that people are going to feel the benefit from. What people will feel the benefit from quickly are things to improve railways, to improve housing, to improve infrastructure. An airport's a bit it's a bit of a pun, but it's a bit pie in the sky right now. Just to give you an example, Jim, I live not very far from the high-speed 1 link that, as people know, goes from Ashford up to St Pancras. But 2 huge stations, Ebbsfleet and Ashford International, both built at enormous public cost, lie mothballed and empty because the trains don't stop there because of Brexit. Then we could go on about HS2 and the delays and the disruption and the blight and the fact that nothing has improved transport for people living in those areas. So, it's all very well coming up with new ideas, but it is a mistake that politicians make to look for something new and shiny instead of dealing with the issues that really need resolving.
What I found was striking was that apparently at a meeting with backbenchers last night, where Rachel Reeves was actually supported by 10 other cabinet ministers to try and head off any suggestion that she's here today and gone tomorrow, Chancellor of the Exchequer kind of phrase. She completely ruled out, because some people were saying, well, if you've got this money for Heathrow, why don't you return to HS2 going from Birmingham to Manchester? And she made apparently some of the land's been sold off now, which I'm surprised at, because Andy Burnham and Andy Street and people were trying to do an HS2 light scheme, and I don't quite see where that's gone now, because it is still a major infrastructure project that's got to be tackled in some way, communications to the north, but apparently that's still ruled out.
Yeah, well, I understand that the last government very sneakily and very swiftly sold off a lot of the land that it had compulsory purchased. I think there are still plans, for HS2 Light, but obviously in a different shape. The other thing that I find so astonishing about Rachel Reeves is that apparently she's tweaking the rules to make it much more attractive for non-doms. In other words, very, very wealthy people to stay in this country or to have their business in this country. At the same time, that we know the impact of the National Insurance Employers' contribution is having a terrible effect on retail and hospitality and hitting people at the bottom end of the working pyramid, if you like.
Yes. Well, I think it was significant that she was pressed to rule out that there wouldn't be a spring budget and declined to do so. One wonders whether there is going to be some sort of spring budget and some adjustments on some of these things. Turning to this theme we're sort of talking about, where politicians seem to be wanting to hurry things up. This is where I think that Nigel Farage, who you'll be dueling with this very evening again, maybe you can get a sense of this from him, that he is the politician almost best placed to try and appeal to that section of the electorate who are giving these surveys about dictators. I'm not remotely saying he's a dictator, but if you've got young people saying they want a strong person in charge who will sweep through all the things, you can imagine Reform UK going into the next election with a sort of Trumpian attitude to institutions and to decision making, which could prove quite attractive.
Yeah, and I gather that they are attracting young people. Particularly young men. Now, you could read into that what you like, because, there is a worrying trend of young men to go for a sort of misogynist type of message, and I'm not for 1 minute saying Reform or Nigel Farage have that, but they are attracting young men who are looking for something. Just for an example, and it may well be that it will be held up in the courts, but of course America is very different. But Donald Trump has said, there are 2 genders, male and female, no transgender people in the military. He's done that. Now, whether that actually happens, or as I say, whether it's challenged or not, we don't know. But for many people, well, they go, thank goodness, that's common sense, let's move on. Whereas, we spend hours, years, days and millions of pounds having reports and surveys and commissions, and you and I both feel the same about social care, I know, possibly because it's nearer to us than it is to Frank. But you know, why do we need another commission, another inquiry to tell us what we already know? And I think that is, you know, part of it is the British Civil Service, which is good. Part of it is a desire to be cautious, which is good. But sometimes you do need to look as though you're doing things a bit quickly, because, you know, literally if your house is falling down, you don't need 3 builders to come and give you an estimate. Well, you probably do for the insurance. Actually, you want somebody to put a bit of tarpaulin on for now.
Yes. I mean, all these things have consequences, and you know, I think, you know, if you are in the green camp, you know, you must be feeling a bit under pressure, because both in terms of planning, you know, there's all sorts of references, disobliging references made to saving newts and £100 million bat reserve on the HS2. There's a sort of drumbeat, even as we are flooded out in our homes and California is burning. There seems to be quite a substantial backlash against the green agenda. I find it fascinating in political terms, because people can see evidence before their eyes, and yet if you were making a comment about the first month of 2025, it ain't been a great one for those that are advocating measures to deal with climate change.
No, exactly. And, you know, just to go back to where we started, many people will be leaving uninhabitable, unfarmable, inhospitable parts of the world because of climate change. So we will see a greater movement of people, migration and immigration, which will have an effect on everybody. And it does seem to me that, you know, yes, I find it deeply disappointing that at the same time the government is saying, yeah, we're going to get rid of the roadblocks to planning for these big infrastructure projects. Well, that's fine, but when you poison chalk streams, when you when you contaminate land, when you make terrible measures that have such an effect on the environment, that you can't undo those. You can't say, right, sorry, love, you've got to pull that down. The damage is already done.
Is it because, in a sense, it's, well, there's two things. One is these things are long term. You know, preserving the chalk streams and driving less, getting the bus more, making our own individual contributions to this, or giving our consent to Ed Miliband's ambitious agenda for greening the economy. That it all seems so long term that people, whatever they say, we may come back to this, by the way, about, oh, we want politicians to make long-term, not short-term decisions. Actually, we want the reverse.
Well, we want both, you know, and that's the problem for all politicians, isn't it? We want it now, we want it yesterday. Oh, we don't want to deal with it right now. You know, we want it, but we don't want to have to change our lifestyle. I think part of the problem on the whole green agenda, if you like, is that many of the people who have been promoting it have been doom and gloom, and they've made people feel, well, there's nothing you can do, you Joe or you Jim, there's nothing you can do. You know, yeah, you can not use plastic bags and you can use the bus more, but actually that's not going to stop, you know, the Arctic ice melting. So I think there's a feeling of hopelessness and a feeling of, you know, being bossed about a bit, and the public don't like that. None of us like it. None of us like to be told, you know, we know better than you, you should behave better. Because at the same time as you say, right, we'll recycle, we'll do this, we'll change our behaviours, and then you think, we don't even have a national recycling plan that means all councils operate the same system. So it is, you know, there's no joined up thinking. If you make it simple for people, here's an example. Fair trade, which, you know, many people care about, which is to make sure that the people who are growing the crops or providing the crops for things like coffee and cocoa get a fair deal, that they're not having to use slave labour, they're not having to use child labour. The people at Fair Trade did the hard work. That means that you and I can go into whatever shop it is and pick a packet of Fair Trade coffee or Fair Trade sugar or whatever it is. So if you want to get people on board for environmental things, you have to make it easy for them. You know, electric cars. Well, we all know the nonsense of having to get a taxi to be able to get to the next charging point and hope that you've got a phone signal in order to be able to charge up your electric car. It's that sort of stuff that makes it hard when it actually should be quite simple.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it is tough. I mean, Bristol City Council are consulting on doing monthly black bin collections, and you know, people are making the practical point that the smelly nappies and so on, and then they say, well, we'll come and collect the nappies. In London, one hears that Sadiq Khan and the boroughs are in real trouble over these low vehicle areas by putting these planters in the middle of the streets and people having to go a long way around. So, you know, there are immediate implications for people's daily life, and it's asking people to see the bigger picture, I suppose, which is really, really tricky for politicians.
Yeah, and it's you could use it for the environment. You could also talk it about in terms of health. We all know that we could all save the NHS a lot of time, grief and money if we took better care of ourselves and we were more responsible about what we eat, the exercise we get and our lifestyle. But, you know, it took a smoking ban brought in by Tony Blair's government to really change it. I mean, you know, can you think of the last time you saw anybody actually smoking a cigarette? I have seen 2 people smoking pipes recently, which is even more rare. But, you know, that has changed hugely.
Yeah, well, I do see people smoking cigarettes. They look mournful. I saw one yesterday, actually. It was pouring with rain, and they were just outside a pub trying to shelter under the roof. With a pipe and a cigarette on the windowsill, you know, so they really have to pay for their habit now.
Yeah, twice over. I know. So, you know, you can do things that you can legislate for behaviour change, or you can try and do it by, you know, exhortation, if you like. But nobody wants to be told, you know, that they're doing wrong. And unfortunately, I think what we've got, and I think this is very noticeable post-COVID, we have become more aggressive and more selfish. And, you know, it's the people who park on the zigzags by a pedestrian crossing. Because it's only me, I'm only going to be 2 minutes, I'm just going in there to get a cup of coffee. Now, you know, if you go to other countries like the Nordic countries or Holland or places like that, nobody would dream of doing that because there is that inbuilt collective responsibility. And I don't think anyone is ever going to achieve that in this country. We had it for a little bit during the pandemic when people were kinder, nicer, looked out for their neighbours, did errands and all of that stuff. And we all thought rather naively that that would last. And actually what's happened, it's made people much more entrenched. You know, that they're going to fight to the front of the queue. They're going to take their kids out of school if they want to go on holiday because it's their right. They're going to argue with the teachers if the teachers say, sorry, little Johnny was late for school, didn't have the PE kit. So, you know, there's a whole culture change. And, you know, I'm going to sound like a ranting lunatic, but that's okay, nothing new there. There is a point where you think this sense of self, which has become completely amplified by social media, does not create cohesive communities.
So how's that going to translate itself into the political parties we elect into government? You know, is it going to encourage somebody to come forward, and it could be reform to sort of not explicitly but implicitly endorse that sort of attitude that, you know, you've got to go for it, you've got to be aggressively entrepreneurial, that you've got your rights, that sort of thing, or I don't know, a gentler agenda proposed by some other party?
Well, you know, there are some things that you could do quite quickly, and devolution, which the government is going ahead with, I think is a good thing. And you can look at the difference, for instance, in Manchester, where there are more people living now in the city centre. You've got the free bus service, which took years for Andy Burnham to wrest back control of the local buses. So you've cut traffic. If you make life easier, if you make those decisions easier for people, you could do that. You know, Angela Rayner or one of her ministers could say, right, we want blanket recycling rules. Every council has got to have the same rules and the same format. Apart from anything else, it would save councils money on spending on different coloured bins depending on which side of the boundary you live. You know, you can actually put much more pressure on packaging companies. You know, you get packages, whether they're from a supermarket or from an Amazon delivery, and you think, really? All this cardboard for this? It's bonkers. We could encourage and help and support people to buy locally, shop locally, if our high streets are thriving, but that means bringing people back to live in high streets in city centres and town centres. You know, support farmers, support not selling off arable and grazing land for housing, and really back that sort of sense of local stuff, which if you do it locally, you know, it works, it spreads.
Going back to the sort of the temper in which we discuss the public discourse, the way in which it's held, of course, the massive influence on that, of course, is social media. And I don't know about you, but it looks to me as if the social media giants now are more or less, with Donald Trump's acquiescence, more or less tearing up most of the rules. It seems a lot of it seems to be sort of potentially going to render the harms bill that was brought in the Act of Parliament now to try and curb some of this and what our youngsters have got access to, and as I say, the nature of debate, what's allowed to be said online. It looks as if these media giants, and you know, they're massive budgets, internationally powerful. Again, in the first month of 2025, we seem to be going backwards on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, who is sucking up to Trump, has got rid of the rules. Now we know why Nick Clegg left Meta. Musk doesn't give a damn, and he'll do whatever it takes. And I bet you when the 75 days of TikTok ownership comes up for review and Trump's ruling that it's got to be sold, at least 50% of it, to an American, that Musk will buy that. So yes, it's a free-for-all. And people like Musk and Zuckerberg are a million times more powerful than the Rothermeres and the Beaverbrooks of previous times, who of course were the press barons, who had enormous influence and wielded it, and were not that different in many ways in the way they wanted to get close to government, close to leadership, in order to set their own agenda. You know, and don't forget how terribly anti-Semitic the Daily Mail was in the 1930s. You know, and yet it is so supposedly British and up there and supportive of all the right things nowadays. So I think I think we should worry about it, but I think the novelty, in a way, will slightly wear off. And I think as people become drowned, actually. They drown in information, fake news, and all the rest of it. So they end up only talking to their friends or only being in the echo chamber. Now, that in itself is dangerous, because how do you get through? If, you know, everybody you know says, oh, COVID is caused by using a computer, wearing headphones, well, that group of people will never appear on a Downtown Politics podcast, which is probably no great loss, actually. But, you know, on a serious note, it is bad for information about health. It's bad for information about security. It's bad for mental health. It's bad for many, many reasons. You can't stop it. The genie is out of the box. But the thing I fear most is that people will turn away from it and they will just talk to the people like them. In which case we have gone back to, you know, medieval times, and the next thing is we'll have a witch finder.
Just to say on that Daily Mail front, I wonder whether they have the humility to reference it, because they recently published the diaries of Unity Mitford, who was from a daughter of a famous British aristocratic family who absolutely loved Hitler and spent a lot of time with him. And they published this diary, and they actually did say that, of course, for a short time they did this infamous headline when Mosley was the British fascist leader, was getting going, saying hurrah for the black shirts. And interestingly, that was a sort of Mosley, sort of in the early 30s when the Depression was on. He represented a dash for power, you know, let's do away with the democratic institutions, you know, I'm a strong man, I can lead the country. But I mean, do you think that social media has almost led directly to this survey where young people say that they want a strong leader? Do you think there's a link?
I think it's amplified, but I think the reason that young people probably I think young people need boundaries. I mean, anyone who's got kids knows that. And I think probably the current generation of Gen Zers, so they're sort of 13 to 25, they've grown up where their parents have been perhaps less strict, schools have been less strict, they've had much more freedom in many ways, although not the freedom that you and I had when we were growing up. You know, they haven't got the freedom to ride a bike round country lanes because people are far too worried about, you know, paedophiles and danger, stranger danger and all the rest of it. But they are, you know, they're driven around by the parents who can afford it, from school to football to ballet to, you know, friends to sleepovers. And so much of family life revolves around these children that actually what I think is at the heart of this is that they crave somebody to tell them what to do. And, you know, the survey I think is quite interesting and worrying, but I think it is also contradictory to what we hear about young people going into employment who can't go in because they're stressed, because they're anxious, they don't know how to make a phone call, they only use text messages, they're not collegiate or you know, cooperative, and they see every criticism as bullying and a slight. So, you know, there's this fearfulness and yet a desire for somebody else to take charge, which, you know, you have to say that's because we have infantilized them quite a lot. And I think, you know, governments have infantilized us as well, so that the only people who are going, hang on a minute, you've got to have a different conversation, are the rather, you know, mocked and derided at the moment centre ground, if you like, for being too wishy-washy and too earnest. And the people like Nigel Farage and Reform, who look like they've got energy and they've got ideas.
Jo, thank you. We'll take a brief break now, and when we come back, we'll look at some of the public policy implications of the awful events that happened in Southport and the sentencing last week and the debate that's followed on from that, and also look at British-American relations after the phone call between Donald Trump and Sir Keir Starmer.
Downtown in Business has hit the ground running in 2025 with events right across the country, including in Manchester, in Birmingham and in Liverpool. And throughout the next 12 months, we'll be joined by mayors, by ministers, by chief executives, by decision makers from local government, regional government and national government, talking to you about the decisions, the policies that impact on your business. If you want to get involved, the fastest growing business organisation in the UK, please visit our website, all the W's downtowninbusiness.com, click on the membership section, and you can find out all the details of how you can join DIB.
Welcome back to this week's podcast, which only contains myself, Jim Hancock, and my good friend Jo Phillips. Frank can't be with us because I changed the date of the podcast, so smack on the wrist for me. Jo, let's turn to British-American relations, because very excitedly our Prime Minister's had a 45-minute phone call with Donald Trump. It really gets to me, this needy attitude that we have to this. Oh, the President's taking a phone call from our Prime Minister. Oh, we're maybe back in favour. I realise the importance of our relations with the United States, but I find it very irritating that we're so needy about all this. So after this phone call, where do you think our relations are with them? Are we going to get sanctions or not?
Well, he wants to come here on a state visit because he's obsessed with the royal family. So, you know, we've got that one. I agree with you. I mean, this fawning and this desperation, it's like 6-year-olds in a playground. And, you know, where is our sense of dignity and our sense of pride? I mean, yes, we do need to have a relationship with America, of course we do, as we do with everybody else pretty much in the world. But it is that sort of, who's in the pecking order? You know, the idea that, you know, Starmer wasn't invited to the inauguration. Well, you know, other leaders don't go, apart from the ones that Trump chose to invite himself. But it is not standard. It's a domestic thing, not an international thing. I mean, I think, you know, by all accounts, they didn't discuss anything difficult like trade or the Chagos Islands. I don't know whether they discussed Peter Mandelson becoming American ambassador, US ambassador. But it was, by all accounts, good-natured, friendly and warm. And Trump said he thinks, well, he said yesterday, he may have changed his mind, who knows, that Keir Starmer is doing a good job and he's a good bloke, even though they disagreed, philosophically. Now, what I think is most interesting is that is a complete split with the views expressed by Donald Trump's real best buddy, Elon Musk, who, as you know, has been extremely critical of Keir Starmer and has even urged his ex-followers to try and bring down this democratically elected government. So that, I think, is a much more interesting thing to read into it. That is this about Trump saying, hang on, I'm the president, and sort of, if you like, a slap over the wrist to Musk and his more extreme views and his extreme exhortations to people. It's got to be better if we can work with America on a basis of friendship, albeit, not necessarily a special relationship, because I don't think that's existed since Thatcher and Reagan. But I think if Starmer has got any sense, this is the way that he can walk the tightrope that people said he couldn't, because it was, you've got to choose America over Europe. No, you don't. You can do both. And the biggest thing coming down the track to us is defence and security. And that's the bit where we will fall out, maybe not, with America if we don't increase defence spending. Now, in order to increase defence spending to 2.5%, and they're talking at the moment of 2.3% of GDP, there will have to be public spending cuts. Now, is Starmer going to do that? Is Rachel Reeves prepared to do that? Is it right that we increase our defence spending? Many people would argue, yes, it is. And with the very real threat still present to Europe because of Ukraine and because of Putin, it is probably right that we do spend more on defence, but at a cost to public services. But it does mean that we have got a natural way for improving our relations with Europe.
Well, indeed. I do think that we need to maintain our relations with Europe, and also we are going to have to increase our defence spending, because it looks to me as if we could be in for quite a fundamental change in our relationship with the United States in terms of defence. I mean, all this grandstanding over Greenland, it's so disrespectful. I mean, the United States is entitled to station troops in Greenland. There's an agreement with Denmark which they could exercise. And I'm quite sure that the Danes, as part of NATO, are quite happy to have discussions with the United States about the changing security environment around Greenland because of the thawing of the ice and the possible intrusion of Chinese and Russian vessels and all that sort of thing. But instead we get this bull in a china shop, really insulting, treating Denmark not as a NATO ally, but as a country to be subjected to pressure, which is completely unnecessary. One has to wonder whether actually an awful lot of this is about the precious metals that are under the Greenland soil, which are becoming more accessible now, and that's part of it. But again, with the announcement that he wants to create an iron dome over the United States, you can see a pattern here where it is America first. And in those circumstances, if we are not prepared to defend ourselves, conceivably, I mean, I'm making a dramatic point here, conceivably without the United States cover, which we've been very grateful for over the years, but we really are going to have to make some really difficult decisions so that potentially we can stand as a hopefully with our Canadian colleagues, providing they're not swallowed up by the American empire as well, as a almost a NATO without the United States. I think we've just got to keep this, because Trump is shifting these tectonic plates, all the things that we've sort of been sure about since the Second World War. He's really shaking it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to that just reminded me of one of John Prescott, the late great John Prescott's great phrases about the Teutonic shapes are shifting. I think at the same time he'd been abroad somewhere and he came back and he said, "Oh, it's good to have your feet back on terracotta."
Yeah.
Anyway,
let's just talk. Sorry, go on.
well, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think what this shows is Trump is a bully, but he is a businessman and he's behaving like a businessman, and he sees something he wants to expand his empire. He's not necessarily thinking strategically, but yeah, he wants Canada. He wants the Gulf of Mexico to be the Gulf of America. Most chillingly, he wants to, in his words, clean out Gaza. And we know perfectly well what that's for, because his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, only in March last year, talked about the wonderful real estate opportunities there. And I think you're absolutely right that we do need, and have needed for a very long time, to be less dependent on America to come and bail us out. And we need to support, there's a huge difference if you're in Greece than to if you're in Norway, where the threat of Russia is very, very real. I've got some friends who've just come back from a year in Norway, and they said, everybody is taking it very, very seriously. Everybody's, they're in prep mode, and it's just a constant threat. So yeah, you're absolutely right, we have to. But again, go back to that survey, would you then have young people going, "Oh no, I don't want to go to war, thank you very much," at the same time as wanting an authoritarian dictatorship?
Yes. We ought to have it before we go on to our last topic, which is the aftermath of Southport. Just a word on Gaza. I mean, nothing's been agreed about the second phase of this peace truce, or whatever you want to call it. But the joy on the faces of those Gazans going home, the thought of a resumption of violence and Israeli attacks and Hamas attacks, that all those people have just gone home. It's inconceivable, surely, that if these negotiations on the next stage of hostage release doesn't work out, that we're going to see a resumption of violence and all those people trekking south again. I mean, it can't happen, can it, Jim?
Well, it can, unfortunately, and I would not be surprised. I would be, like many people, absolutely horrified if it does. But I think it does say something about the hope, in the darkest circumstances, that you can rebuild. And these people are going back to nothing because the pull of home is so strong. And, it's inconceivable to us, Jim, that you could walk all those miles back to rubble that used to be your house, but you would rather be there and start rebuilding it. And it's not like the people whose fires have been destroyed in Los Angeles, where they can go and stay in hotels, and the insurance companies, and they've got the money most of the people have got the money to pay for repairs. This is total devastation. But I think it is a reason to think that all the time humanity has hope, there is hope for all of us.
Yes. Well, the Gazan people, Palestinian people, are incredibly resourceful and incredibly intelligent. And I can understand why they still seem to be affiliated to Hamas, certainly in the Gaza area, to represent them. And that's going to be highly problematic if they could only break free from that and elect democratic leaders and prepare to live in peace with Israel, and country-wise Israel was to rein in its settlers who are behaving disgracefully. You could see a way through with the masses of money that Saudi Arabia could pour into that two-state solution. You can see the solution over the horizon, but here am I pontificating upon years of mutual bitterness between the Jews and the Palestinian people. There's not much point in me saying it, but that is ultimately, it has to be the resolution of it. Can we just finally move on to the outcome from the Southport dreadful tragedy on our own doorstep here? And the latest news is this report that was commissioned by the Home Secretary into what should the rules governing the way in which the state is monitoring far left and far right extremists, and whether that should be expanded into a number of other areas. And the Home Secretary sort of this morning rapidly sort of disowned this report, which would have, because the big criticism was that this dreadful man, as he did become a man during the course of the trial, wasn't picked up by the agencies because he wasn't specifically aligned with a terrorist organisation, and it's potentially a terrible loophole. But what do you make of the Home Secretary's decision not to support this report and to try and expand it to allow the authorities and the agencies to take into account these people who don't have a particular affiliation to a terrorist organisation, but nevertheless have a very, very unhealthy obsession with killing and that sort of thing?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because, first of all, we haven't seen the full report. We've seen leaks from it this morning. And, my initial reaction is, what's the point of, having an urgent review report and then saying, but I reject it because it doesn't say what I want. It does sound to me, from what I have heard this morning and listening to excellent commentators like Danny Shaw and various other sort of terrorism and police experts, there are two things here. One is the total failure of multiple agencies to deal with Axel Rudakana, the murderer of the little girls in Southport. And he was referred to Prevent 3 times, but because he didn't tick a box for terrorism, it wasn't thought necessary to take that any further. But he was also referred to social services and through school to other agencies, none of whom appeared to talk to each other. And I think there is certainly a case for looking at the way that we ask people to tick a box. So does this person fit your image of a terrorist? Well, you don't have to be an affiliated or a member of an affiliated group or have some ideological thing to create terror. Those two are completely different things. There is something about, and again it comes back to media companies and what is available. This kid had been looking at IRA staff school shootings, was obsessed with American school shootings, genocide in Rwanda where his parents came from, of course, all sorts of things, a terror attack in New Zealand. He wasn't a terrorist. He was a deeply disturbed, absolutely sort of psychotic individual who should have been picked up earlier along the route. And I think the problem with expanding the rules, if you like, what you need to do is to expand the common sense. You need to expand the curiosity of those tasked with. So if you get a kid who's been expelled from school, if you get a kid who fails to engage with the mental health support, etc., etc. I mean, another example, Jim, which is not Southport, but I think is equally shocking, is the young mother who was jailed for 10 years for going out and leaving her 4 little boys, 2 sets of twins, to die in a house full of excrement in a blazing inferno. She was known to social services and had mental health issues. So, you have to ask, why was she allowed to have charge of those 4 little boys if she was known to be a risk to herself and a risk to them? And I think this is the problem facing Yvette Cooper, that if you try and legislate, you invariably end up with a tick box mentality. And the people who are going through the motions of that, there will be those who go, hang on a minute, this doesn't fit the boxes, let's look at something else. But there will be others who'll go, no, not us, pass it on to somebody else. And that's the problem. It's very difficult to legislate. If you legislate, as we have discussed before, Suella Braverman, when she was Home Secretary, wanted to ban the right to peaceful protest, but only for the people that she didn't like. And that's the problem. We've got to be a little bit more questioning and not look to stick labels on people. And I think that's part of the problem, that we go, oh, he's Islamic, it's Islam, it's fundamental Islamism. No, it's not. It's a kid deeply disturbed who should have been picked up a long time ago.
One thing that does occur to me is that obviously these dreadful cases receive the headlines, and we hear far less about the number of people that the agencies perhaps do pick up, because there must be an awful lot of casework, and that brings us to the question of resources. It's unfashionable because it sounds like they're trying to make an excuse for the fact that these agencies didn't talk to each other. But we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of disturbed people around, and identifying the ones that are going to be really difficult, and ones that, because of resources implications, you take children into care, there are resources implications of that. We've always got to have that in mind, and just the workload that we don't always acknowledge. I do think that needs to be put into the thing as well. But let's hope that this inquiry doesn't take too long, because it's going to come up with there needs to be more joined up thinking. There needs to be more resources. We can almost write the final report now.
Yeah, and in 2016 there was a report, I think it was Louise Casey, because she's the only one that does them, which was commissioned by the then Tory government about integration and community cohesion. And none of the recommendations were put into place. But this isn't about community cohesion, it's about mental health. And you're absolutely right, Jim, it's all about resources. But what I find very chilling, and again, it comes back to the social media amplification. We've now got, voices raised, bring back the death penalty, which is appalling and shocking. But probably like the bloke who's got a pub in Warwickshire who wants to overturn a democratically elected government, there'll be a petition. But, you only have to say, all right, bring back the death penalty. Where does that leave Lucy Letby when you've got, many people, including MPs and other people, saying, hang on, it's not a fair trial. It's not a route we want to go down. But we do need to be a bit more sensible and a bit more curious.
I do think the report that Cooper's rejected, it did raise the possibility of bringing things like misogyny into the scope of it. I do tend to agree with the Home Secretary that if you become focused on too many things, misogyny is obviously a serious problem, but there has to be a gradation of this, otherwise focus will be lost.
Yeah, and you can't legislate for everything. There are people who say things who, don't have ill intent, aren't going out to act on them. There is, we've come a long way from page 3 girls, and, we've got much better conditions still for women, except we still lag behind in pay, pensions, healthcare, and many, many other things. Well, yeah, how long have we got? We could do this as a 3-part series, at least. But, there are things that have changed over the years, and certainly in your and my lifetime, whether it's about race, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc. So we can do those things, but we shouldn't always necessarily look to legislation, because who is going to legislate? And at the same time, if you talk about misogyny, we know perfectly well that the police, in many, many cases, don't take incidences of flashing indecent exposure seriously. And yet we know very well that that is quite often the beginning of somebody going on to commit much worse crimes. So, there's that sort of thing. There's things about stalking. We know the police either don't or can't investigate mobile phone theft, and yet at the weekend there was an interview with Mark Rowley saying this is about organised crime. It's about what can we all do. It sounds a bit girl guidish, but you can't always just go, oh yeah, make a law, because if there's no one to bring it, to enforce it, it's not going to happen.
Jo, thank you very much indeed. That's our hour almost up. And next week we'll be the return of Frank McKenna, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. But thank you very much indeed for joining us for this week's review of the news.